coming over!
Come on! They're getting through! Keep going, this way, through the truck!
Move, Ellie, move!
It's open, come on!
Man, that was close.
There's no doubt that I'm partial to games originally released in the arcades, like fighting games and shmups, but despite that, my favorite video game genre is actually action-adventure games. I'm a huge fan of games that combine fun, engaging action gameplay with an interesting story filled with well-written characters. Because of this, many of my favorite games of all time, a future list perhaps, belong to this magical and time-honored genre. And yeah, they are definitely way more of a time commitment than, let's say, Gunbird 2, which you can beat in less time than it takes to drop a deuce. However, the right action-adventure game will cause hours to fade away in what feels like minutes and have you begging for more once the credits roll. This was exactly my experience with The Last of Us, released seemingly forever ago in 2013 on the PlayStation 3. I actually first played The Last of Us several years after it came out, all the way in 2016 actually. I originally overlooked The Last of Us despite its glowing critical and fan reviews, mostly because of how obnoxiously oversaturated pop culture was with zombie media back then. Zombie movies, zombie games, zombie TV shows, zombie comics, I mean, Jesus Christ. And look, I'm not some hipster who rejects anything popular or mainstream, but when you beat me over the head with something over and over again, no matter how good it might be, I'm going to lose interest really, really fast. And yeah, even though zombies were still the it thing back in 2016, I couldn't resist trying this game out. And yes, The Last of Us is just as good as those very generous reviews say it is. Well, mostly. The Last of Us has become to video games what The Walking Dead is to zombie TV shows, or at least used to be, or the original 1978 Dawn of the Dead is to zombie movies. There are many, many examples of zombie video games at this point, but The Last of Us is still the very best. Join me now as I take a look at The Last of Us and dive into why this game is so loved and respected even to this day, and why it not only holds up as the best zombie video game, but also one of the best video games ever made. And before I jump into this game, keep in mind this is mostly a spoiler-free review. I say mostly because I'll be showing footage from some parts in the game that occur later on. While I'm not going to show any of the cutscenes that spoil any of the main character moments or story, you will see areas and weapons that don't appear until later into the game. With that out of the way, I'll only be discussing very basic plot details of what The Last of Us is about. So in other words, I won't be blowing the lid off of anything super spoilery, so take a deep breath and relax. But on that note, let's jump into the story of The Last of Us.
Oh, man.
Hey, what happened to sleeping?
Okay, I know it doesn't look like it, but this here is not a bad read. Only one problem. Right there. To be continued.
At this point, it should be no surprise to anyone that just like every other zombie movie, book, or game, The Last of Us mostly takes place in a dystopian future where humanity and society has fallen to an overwhelming zombie pandemic. I have to say, playing this game again in 2020 while in the midst of a real-life global pandemic definitely made the setting of this game a lot more relatable than it was back in the carefree early and mid-2010s. The Last of Us begins with you playing as Joel, the game's main character, as you're living out a normal evening with his daughter in the year 2013, right before all hell breaks loose and the pandemic starts. Shit goes down, and you're then catapulted by the game 20 years into the future, where a much more hardened Joel must fight for survival in a world overrun with infected, martial law, and various factions fighting for dominance. Soon after you start the game, you'll team up with your friend Tess before meeting the game's other main character, Ellie. Ellie is a 14-year-old girl whom, unlike Joel, has only known the current world of infected, death, and violence, and it becomes Joel's duty to get Ellie across the country for reasons I'll let you discover if you ever decide to play this game. While Joel is an amazing character and one I thoroughly enjoyed playing as throughout the majority of this game, Ellie is actually my favorite character in The Last of Us. Watching her and Joel develop individually and together was the absolute highlight of The Last of Us for me. Throughout the game, you will want to find out what happens to them next constantly, and hearing these two interact throughout the game not only fills in crucial plot points, but also becomes a reward in itself with just how good the writing, dialogue, and voice acting is. Even though the characters in the story are my favorite part about The Last of Us and need to be experienced, there are also many other excellent aspects to this game. Visually, The Last of Us is an absolutely incredible looking game. Being originally released on the PS3 at the very tail end of that console's life, this game pushes that console to its absolute limits in terms of what it's capable of doing visually. And holy shit, this game stands out as one of the very best looking, if not the very best looking PS3 game ever made. The Last of Us was given a light remaster and re-release on the PS4 the year after it originally came out on the PS3. What you've actually been watching so far is from The Last of Us Remastered on the PS4, but even with the improvements to textures, colors, and frame rates, it's so close that you really can't go wrong with either version. On top of the graphics, the amount of detail present in The Last of Us has been matched by very few games, even to this day. Beyond the destroyed cities you'll be navigating through and struggling to survive in, you'll also find yourself in sewers, forests, graveyards, people's abandoned homes, and a plethora of other locales that make every part of this game visually distinct and memorable. Not only that, but while you're in these destroyed and decaying settings, you'll see constant reminders of the world that once was. You'll see pictures of people's friends and families on their desks and on the walls of their homes. You'll see cars and buses that 20 years of nature has claimed, and you'll also see signs of battles and struggles from long ago that not only add to the game's incredible narrative, but make The Last of Us's world immersive and believable. Character animations are also top-notch here as well. The range of expression, emotion, and detail with every single character in this game is truly something special. Characters are all very distinct from one another visually, but also in how they portray and express their feelings as well. Every character interacts and deals with the world around them in a unique way, which makes everything they do or say memorable in some way. Visually, this is executed to near perfection, which absolutely contributes to how believable and relatable every character in this game is. The enemies in The Last of Us are also impressive looking. While there are some recycled enemy skins, most of the infected you encounter will look distinct from any others that you've seen earlier in the game. On top of that, there are various enemy types in this game, ranging from the recently infected to people who look like they've been infected for probably a few years, to the heavily infected, also known as clickers. The clickers and their variants especially show off a level of creativity not seen in many other zombie media I'm aware of, and visually these things are creepy as You'll also be battling various human-type enemies, aka hunters as well, whom don't show off the same level of distinct design as the undead, but are still very well designed overall. The audio in The Last of Us is also top-notch. As I mentioned earlier, the interaction between characters is one of the highlights in this game, and that is in no small part to how perfect the voice acting is. Literally every single character, no matter how important or unimportant to the plot, is voice acted near flawlessly, further adding to the believability of this world as you play through the story.
I'm alright! Are you okay?
No! You scared the shit out of me!
The soundtrack of The Last of Us is also pretty damn good. When you're in a tense or nightmare-inducing situation, the music reflects that with the beating of drums and other noises that really ramp your anxiety up as you attempt to sneak around a room to avoid infected or hunters. On the other end of the spectrum, there are some absolutely beautiful tracks as well that complement those oddly serene moments in this game where you find yourself looking at the beauty that still exists in the world despite it having gone to shit decades ago. The composition all around is top-notch, and while it isn't necessarily something I jam out to in my car, it deserves to be commended for how masterfully it was put together. Other pieces of standout audio go to the various sound effects used within the game. Weapons definitely sound impactful, and while I'm not a gun nut who can describe the difference between one gun and another very similar gun, weapons all sound excellent overall. With nature taking over the decaying world of humanity, you'll also hear things like birds chirping, rivers and streams, and various other sounds that remind you that you're in a world reclaimed by nature. And then there's the sounds the infected make, which are downright disturbing and creepy. The recently infected make random agonizing screams and whimpers as if deep down inside they're trying to hold on to any humanity they have left. Meanwhile, there's the clicks from the appropriately named clickers that will immediately put you on edge when you hear one of these assholes lurking in the other room or around a corner. They also sound equally creepy when you've blown your cover and they come rushing at you. But yeah, the enemies in this game are very creepy in no small part to how outstanding the sound design is in The Last of Us. At this point, you're probably thinking, well, this guy's just gonna give this game a near perfect review as well. Nothing new to see here, folks. And while yes, I do have a ton of glowing praise for this game, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. In fact, the next thing I want to talk about in this game, the gameplay, is by far The Last of Us's weakest area. That's a real shame considering, The Last of Us is kind of a game, so, gameplay is kind of important and all, just kind of saying. So first and foremost, no, The Last of Us's gameplay is not disastrous, broken, or terrible by any stretch of the imagination. However, it is still noticeably flawed flawed and at times even clunky. The Last of Us is a third-person shooter that relies heavily on taking cover, sneaking around, and using stealth as much as possible to take down enemies rather than just running in guns blazing. In fact, playing the game the latter way is a good way of getting yourself killed quickly. While this is a fairly realistic way of looking at how one guy and a kid could survive the situations they're in throughout the game, it doesn't help that the stealth is alright at the best of times and kinda crappy at the worst. You are given several abilities that help you navigate through the game's various areas, which have you sneaking around walls, furniture, and other objects to remain undetected by the game's many enemies. Both infected and non-infected follow a predetermined path for the most part, which allows you to carefully time when and where you plan on taking them out without being detected by other enemies nearby. You are given a listen ability that allows you to essentially see the outline of enemies behind walls and in other nearby rooms. This further gives you the ability to plan out your approach to take out each enemy one by one in a specific area, Metal Gear Solid style. Except there's a few problems here. First off, the listen ability seems to work when it feels like it half the time. I don't know how many times I scanned a room or around a corner to detect nothing at all, only for an enemy to be standing right in front of me or behind me as soon as I entered. There were also times that I broke cover even though I was clearly hidden behind an object, but somehow an enemy spotted me. On the flip side of that, however, I was also not detected several times despite pretty much being right in front of an infected or a hunter. To be fair, I feel like the stealth and your ability to detect nearby foes does work about 75% of the time the way it should, but for a game that is very, very stealth heavy, that other 25% gets real old real fast. Another mechanic in this game that has issues is using empty bottles and bricks found throughout every area in the game to divert enemies away from you or into a specific area. I found especially with infected that they often would not respond to something being thrown unless it was thrown relatively close to them, yet other times I could throw something a mile away and they'd all come running at the sound instantly. This would produce some very frustrating scenarios where I'd throw the one and only brick or bottle I had in order to lure enemies to a specific area, only for them to completely ignore it like a flea fart. Like the stealth, the inconsistency in this mechanic definitely resulted in some needless frustration at several junctures throughout the game. When you're not sneaking up on enemies and shanking them in the throat, The Last of Us will have you taking down infected and human enemies directly with a variety of guns and melee weapons. It's just too bad the combat in this game is just okay as well. As you'd expect, shooting enemies, undead or living, in the head is what you're going to want to aim for whenever you try and take them out. It's just too bad the aiming in The Last of Us isn't the greatest, and this becomes most obvious when trying to hit a flailing clicker or running hunter in the head. Try doing this when you have 3 or more enemies coming at you, and you'll be lucky if you come out the other end alive. Luckily, the game gives you a pretty generous arsenal to play around with, and certain scenarios definitely call for certain weapons. Having a lot of enemies far away from you definitely calls for a weapon like your rifle or bow, whereas running into infected or non-infected in a cramped building or room makes weapons like the revolver or shotgun a better fit. There are also melee weapons which come in handy in close range combat or as a quick way of dealing with enemies who've got the jump on you. The melee weapons typically work fine as using them launches the game into a cutscene where you're almost guaranteed to take the enemy out, assuming your weapon has enough endurance left to finish them off. Things like a 2x4 are going to be less sturdy and strong than a lead pipe and break after fewer uses. The melee weapons can also be upgraded using various supplies you find in the environment as well, turning that boring, unassuming baseball bat into a frickin' morning star made of office supplies. Speaking of these upgrade items you find in the environment, you can also craft weapons like shivs, dirty bombs, and molotovs, which also have their advantages over one another depending on the enemy, area, or circumstance you're in. The upgrade items that you find to craft these weapons come in the form of various things like nails, scissors, gauze, and rubbing alcohol you find throughout the game. You can also craft non-weapons like first aid kits and sugar bombs, which isn't just some cute nickname you give to your dog, but rather it creates a smoke screen making it harder for enemies to see and detect you. There are also these miscellaneous parts you can collect throughout the game as well, which allow you to upgrade your weapons and give them things like greater ammo capacity or range. There are also upgrades in the form of pills you find throughout the game. What kind of pills are these? Is Joel doping up on Vicodin and benzos so he can decrease the amount of weapon sway he has? Might have to try that out myself. Kidding, but yeah, finding enough pills allows you to level Joel up, increasing his various abilities. This gives the game a very RPG-esque feel that I really liked and motivated me to obsessively go through every drawer, closet, and locker in every room I encountered. But hey, I guess if you were living in a post-apocalyptic world, you'd be doing this anyways to find whatever supplies you could to survive. The Last of Us also has various environmental puzzles as well that require you to do things like figuring out how to get to an adjacent rooftop, get around a giant hole in the floor, or unlocking a door by supplying it power from somewhere else. These puzzles also include the somewhat infamous Ellie raft puzzles, which have you ferrying Ellie across a body of water on a wooden crate or some other object after finding that crate or object in a relatively hidden location. These sections never really bothered me that much, and I always wondered why people act like these are the worst parts of the game. You only have to do them like 3 or 4 times throughout the entire game, and they aren't particularly challenging or frustrating. In fact, doing anything with Ellie, as well as any of the other companions you encounter throughout the game, are pretty good as far as wayfinding and also them not getting in your way or being any sort of hindrance. So yeah, overall the gameplay isn't terrible, but I definitely found it to be the weakest part of the game. This brings me to another common criticism of The Last of Us, as well as other recent Naughty Dog games, where they're often accused of being interactive movies rather than games. Yes, there are a ton of cutscenes and scripted sequences in The Last of Us, but you'll still be actually playing the game 90% of the time, which makes this criticism a bit disingenuous in my opinion. It's just really too bad the gameplay isn't anything remarkable in what is otherwise a really remarkable game. Before I wrap this review up, I also wanted to briefly discuss the story DLC for The Last of Us, Left Behind. This DLC focuses around Ellie and fills in 2 story gaps that aren't necessarily crucial to understanding what happens in the main game, but rather do a good job at supplementing it. I definitely found one portion of the story to be way more interesting and relevant than the other, but I'll let you play the DLC and decide for yourself. Luckily, it's included for free on The Last of Us Remastered on the PS4, so that certainly gives that version an advantage over the PS3 version, in addition to the slightly upgraded visuals. Is The Last of Us a masterpiece? Not quite, but it's not really far off either. I feel like in order for a game to be considered a masterpiece, it has to be near flawless. And while it would be a hard argument to say the visuals, audio, and story weren't about as good as you can get for a game released in 2013, hell, even today, the gameplay is what really holds this game back. Still, regardless of some inconsistent and frustrating gameplay elements, The Last of Us does a good enough job at combining everything else to be one of the most polished and unforgettable gaming experiences you will ever have. The 9.5 out of 10 and perfect scores this game received might have been a little bit too generous, but to say this game is a solid 9 out of 10 game is hardly an exaggeration. But you should absolutely play The Last of Us. It's hard to imagine anyone being disappointed with it. And that's all I have to say about that. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Until next time.